Okay, welcome everyone for this wonderful evening with Marisa Gowdy and Maureen. You can tell I'm nervous in front of the cameras. I'm like, my brain is gone. And Maureen Buscarino. We're here to have an evening of Irish storytelling and harp. And Marisa is a writer and a storytelling coach, and she has her business cards over here if anyone is interested. And she has books as well. And we also have a little donation box so that we can make a little money tonight.
And there's wine.
And there's wine. Yes. And I'm going to stop stumbling over my words and hand it over to Marisa.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you. Falcha, which is the Irish for welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Amy, for inviting me to be here tonight, and to Maureen for being with me in this first endeavor. So the reason that Amy invited me here was my new podcast, KnotWork Storytelling, which just started on February 2nd, and I guess we're 5 or 6 episodes in. And I was so touched when Amy invited me to do a launch event here, back when I first announced the podcast back in Samhain in October. Part of that is that I wrote a book that came out February of 2 years ago. And as you might imagine, launching that book was not what I imagined. So, because I put things off, I said, oh, we'll launch the book in February, but all the events will be in March when it's easier, when there'll be less snow. And here we are. So I'm just really grateful to sort of have this coming out creatively for the podcast, which I'm incredibly excited about. You know, it's a very digital medium, but to me it's such a very personal and very, there's so much connection already being made, even though it is so intangible in so many ways. So tonight I have a story for you from Ireland. But I want to first acknowledge the land that we're here upon right now, and that we're here in the land of the Lenape people. And those are stories I don't know yet. I'm hoping that in my own journey as a storyteller, I'll learn more of them, be able to share more of them, be able to share some Lenape storytellers with you on the podcast as I get my feet under me. But in the spirit of starting with where we are, which I believe we must do when we are trying to figure out who we are as individuals, as people who have come to a land, as people who are the, you know, the antecedents of, or the ones who are the opposite of ancestors, when our ancestors were colonizers, and we need to learn how to be with the land we live upon, be with the stories that make us here who we are now, and the stories that we came from. So for me, as a woman who was didn't necessarily know she had an Irish family until Ireland found me. I was a miserable 13-year-old girl who didn't much like going to middle school. My middle schooler here does like going to middle school, so I'm very excited to say that we can rewrite our stories and our history within one generation. But I was a 13-year-old girl who would just stay home and watch Far and Away, that really bad Tom Cruise movie, over and over. Like the VHS tape would stop. I would take it out of the VCR, dutifully put it in the rewinder, because you shouldn't rewind on your VHS player because it's bad for it. Rewind the tape and plunk it back in and watch it again. And so I got all A's. I was luckily a smart kid, and a lifelong passion was formed for Irish culture, for Irish literature, for Irish language, what little of it I have, what I'm learning right now and getting back. Because my journey took me from the couch. In 8th grade, I did get off the couch, which was very good for everyone. I ended up at Boston College, chose it because of its Irish Studies department. Went to Galway for my junior year, got my master's degree in Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at University College Dublin. Was supposed to fly out 9/11/2001 from Logan Airport. So to say that that was an odd year to be away would be an understatement. So what I thought was going to be a permanent trip, that I was going to go for the master's, the PhD, to stay and become a professional Irish person. If Miss Lawrence is watching right now, my AP English teacher from high school, who helped me write my college essay for Boston College, we included that phrase in my college essay. But life has other plans, and I ended up coming home and living an American life and never lost this, but have been rediscovering it over the years. I named my daughters Moira and Mairead. Clearly, I never forgot this. But this ability to really stand with you all and be in this story and all these stories means so much because it's a coming home for me as well as a welcoming in to all of you. So I also want to honor that tonight we're going to be telling a story that is about creativity and relationships in our natural world. And that Ireland has a lot of stories of war and survival and many stories of invasion. And so if many of us are carrying that in us tonight, I just want to honor that. I want to honor the Ukrainian people and what's happening in the world. And that we may be leaving that outside for the next 30 minutes or so, but we look to these stories. We tell these stories because they help us sort out who we are right in this moment so that we can face these next challenges that are coming toward us. Because in so many ways, this podcast itself feels like, really? At a time like this? You're gonna go tell the ancient stories? Because right now we're living some really serious crises. Maybe we should think about those. And I've wrestled with that a lot myself and wondered if it makes sense to go back and to keep looking backward when we need to be standing here and looking forward. But what I know in my bones is that ancient stories are medicine for our modern maladies. They're medicine for the soul. And when we can allow ourselves this connection and this conversation with the past, it enables us to have conversations now in the present. So I'm going to tell us a story and then open us up to have a little chat about it, because that's actually what a lot of the podcast itself is built on. Each episode includes a story and then a conversation with my guest about why it still matters and why it has resonance. So I want to welcome Maureen and ask Maureen to say a couple of words about herself before we dive in with the story.
Sure.
And thank you.
So I'm Maureen Buscarino, and this is it's called a modern Irish harp, or some people call it a neo-Irish harp. It predates like what you normally see or think of as a harp in the orchestra, like those gigantic ones. Those have pedals on them. This has levers on it for me to change keys. Concert pedal harp, you change the keys with your feet. This is modeled after, it's kind of a hybrid of the two harps. The ancient harp of Ireland, before Cromwell came in and before a lot of the Irish society kind of disappeared under a lot of Cromwell's edicts, the harpist was kind of the right hand to the king. And the stories that were told, the harp would always accompany the bard. So when stories were told, the harp was always there. And so the harpist was kind of like second in line or third in line to the king. So the harp was that important, and music was that important to people of Ireland. So, and then as the harp, when Cromwell came into Ireland and a lot of the culture became I guess, underground or hidden in a lot of ways. As the harp became less and less heard, it became more and more of a symbol for the people of Ireland. And that's why it's the only country that I know of in the world that has a harp or a musical instrument as its symbol to this day. But a lot of the songs were passed on through the generations. So this is this is made by a harp maker in Canada. So and the harp is actually coming back. Like this type of harp is coming back into becoming more and more popular, which is really wonderful. But and I'll be playing traditional Irish tunes. Some have been passed on and preserved through fiddlers or through pipers when the harp tradition was kind of silent for such a long time. So that's it. Yeah, and I also have a podcast called Harp Song where I interview harpists from around the world. And my company is Moon Over the Trees Music and Theater Production. So if you want to sign up and have any questions about harp or any of the songs and things or stories too, and I look forward to working together with you some more. So.
And a plug for Hudson Valley Women in Business, which is actually where Maureen and I met this summer, the one mixer they had. We were wearing very similar clothing, which was the only, I mean, there was 100 women there, and it just was like, hey, you look really nice, so do you. And it's like, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I went to University College of Limerick for musicology. I'm like, oh, I went to University College of Dublin for Anglo-Irish literature, and then here we are. So everything kind of, it's about fashion, folks. It's about fashion. So I want to share with you a teensy bit of inside baseball before we start, because that's actually part of the story itself. And as I started tonight thinking about whose land we are on, the traditions that we come from, the sense that these stories themselves are all written down, though we have an oral tradition. The stories that I am rooting my work in mostly comes from the monastic manuscripts of Ireland, the Celtic world, but mostly Ireland. And so we have all of these written down by the monks. So they were the older pagan stories in many cases that have come through many different forms before they got to the page. And that leaves us with a really interesting creative question, right? So there was a bunch of lads who sat around in their very cold, drafty monasteries and wrote all this stuff down. Are they right? Well, they're the oldest thing we have. And I tell these stories in many ways to look at how have we shifted and changed these stories to suit us in our modern lives. When is that a good thing? And when is that, of course, a really important creative project? And when is that like, actually, I'm not sure you could change that. I don't know. Let me see. Without being horribly pedantic and miserable. Because I mean, I have an academic background, but I am not an academic necessarily in that sense. So my work is always to say, how can we really honor the truth of the source and speak of it pretty knowledgeably as best we can, and also do the creative work of saying, let's make this matter and let's make this exciting. There's an Irish phrase called fiche fuacha, which means interwoven, or and of course, actually, one of my teachers, who, if you listen to episode 1 of the podcast, you'll meet Kate Chadbourne, who was my daughter's singing teacher, who was my first Irish teacher back in college, and she offers this phrase in her stories about Bridget. And of course, it's perfect for KnotWork, fiche fuacha. How do we weave together the ancient and the modern? So that's a little bit in this story. Just to kind of give you a little background. And 2 other Irish words I want to teach before we come in. My pronunciation is coming along, so don't quote me, but we're getting there.
No tape.
But the good news is there's so many dialects in Ireland, and I've been taught with all the different dialects by the different teachers. I'm like, oh, well, you know, I was just remembering the Donegal Irish right there. Yep, not the Connemara. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so. Fian means wild, and that idea is going to come through this story. And frame scale, which means origin or root story. Scale is the word story in Irish, and frame is origin or root. And so that's to me what I'm trying to honor in this, to do both fiche fuacha and to also give the frame scale its own space. So I'm going to breathe. I'm going to ask you to play a little song, a little tune for us, and then we'll get started. Fado in Éireann. There was a poet of great skill and fame. Ireland, of course, is a country known for its poets, its fila. And Ireland is known for its ban fila, too. The story I shall tell you is of Cana Cludhmor was a ban fila. Cana Cludhmor was a woman, a poet, and a person of great skill and renown. Ban fila means woman poet in the Irish. Cludhmor means of great fame. Now, her story has been folded into a couple dozen lines. Her story has left much room for interpretation. And yes, misinterpretation. If your passions tend toward the mythic, the Celtic, and the obscure, you might have read that Cludhmor was an Irish goddess of poetry and inspiration. You might have come across a website or two that names her as the inventor of the harp. Now, in the great modern quest for goddesses and a deep desire to resuscitate ancient magic, someone, not so very long ago, spun a tale of a harp-making goddess by editing the very last line of a brief passage we find in a medieval Irish book called the Invention, or the Proceedings of the Great Bardic Institution. That modern twist on the story endures, across the internet at least. If you go to the Oracle, and by that I do mean Google, and you ask about Cludhmor, you'll hear that she's a deity. You'll be invited to call her Canola. And you'll see her credited with the creation of Ireland's most powerful symbol and most beautiful instrument. While I believe that it's a nice enough idea, I wonder if the real tale is actually even richer and more full of possibility. Even more because it's true. Well, again, true in the sense that it was written down by a bunch of monks in County Cork in the Book of Cludhmor in the 14th century. It's up to you if you want to believe what the medieval lads wrote down on the vellum, or if you feel more comfortable with Wikipedia. We'll leave it there. Because in my story, I will rob this mythic woman of none of her power, even as I strip her of her divine status and place the harp maker's tools in the hands of another. We'll land at a different place, a place that feels a bit more human and a bit more like what I think we need right now. So come wander with me. We'll wander on the solid enough ground of the manuscripts when we can, and we'll ask the graces of history and inspiration to carry us when we soar together into the thinner air of what might be. Because after all, that is the realm of the storyteller. Would not have been born a bonfima. She would have been born with a love of verse. She would have been born with a gift of a clever turn of phrase. As soon as she could speak, folk would have noticed the music of her speech, and everyone would have remarked the uncanny magic of her memory when she was just a wee girl. As a member of the Fila class, the elite poets, Cludhmor would have committed nearly 200 great tales to memory. These were the stories that took an entire night to tell. She would have been known as a seer as well. She might have carried the gift of prophecy and vision far surpassing that of the royals and even the druid priests of her time. Winking at the girl in the back on her phone. Mom has great vision as a seer and would love for you to put your phone away. And Dad! Oh, hi, Dad! My little one has the sniffles, so he's home with her. My husband, not my dad. My dad's supposed to be watching on Facebook. Hi, Dad! Anyway, so Cludhmor would have studied for 12 years to earn her place amongst the Fila. She would have proven herself at school, a place where it didn't so much matter what was going on underneath your robes. So how was it that after all this study, all this fame, she would end up married? And much more than that, how is it that after all this, as the book says, she would be married to a man that she hated? Well, let's take a flight of fancy together. We're going to root it in what we know of human nature. Because even in the golden age of poets, we can assume that certain kinds of fathers were certain kinds of fathers. And men made deals with one another on behalf of themselves and their unwitting offspring. Marriages were the stuff of statecraft and border security. We do not know Cludhmor's father's name. Apparently, he was much less memorable than his impressive daughter. Perhaps he was a foolish man who had no ear for poetry. Perhaps he was a greedy man who valued better grazing land more than he valued his daughter's unique gifts. Perhaps he was a jealous man who coveted her ability to weave the tales of commoners and kings and hold an audience in thrall. The question is, if she was a seer, did Cludhmor foresee her marriage to a man named Macwell? Perhaps she looked into the fires or read the pattern of cranes in the sky, and she saw that a man named Midgewell would ride in a chariot in search of a bride for his son. Now, marriage was a nuanced institution in early Ireland. The Brehon laws, those unique laws unique to this tiny island, had a lot to say about most layers of society. There were at least 9 different kinds of marriage that might have ruled Cludhmor and Macwell's union. We can guess that she was a prize and that a bride price was paid. But the world would have recognized the marriage even if she'd been abducted or run off with him in a fit of passion or rebellion. Yeah, we can only speculate on the nature of their relationship. We can only judge it by its ruins and its potential resurrection. So I ask you to imagine Cludhmor slipping from her shared bed before first light, casting a cold look over her shoulder as she stepped across the threshold into a chilly April morning, not so long before the fertility festival of Yaltana. She had no desire to greet the time of the blossoms and beginnings with that man of hers. Remember, she hated him. To leave in such a way, with no excuse that the law or their families would recognize, that was a grievous decision. There were plenty of reasons that she could have walked out under the noonday sun and declared that their union was null and void. If he had taken up with another woman, if he had refused to support her, if he had tricked her into marriage through sorcery. Those are just a few of the examples. But Macwell was guilty of none of that. They had not been together long enough for her to prove that he was incapable of giving her a child. She had no proof he'd taken a male lover. He was not fat, and she did not know him to brag about their intimate lives. All these are actually written down as potential reasons for divorce. We know that Macwell was innocent of all of these sins because she left in secret. We can imagine she left carrying only a small satchel with a bit of bread and cheese, maybe a skin of wine or water. She left on foot, striding westward to a place where the hills were empty and the distant shores were wild. As Cludhmor strode away from her marital home, she felt herself coming back to herself. Recovered a wildness that she knew at her core, but she had always denied. What does a child prodigy know of wildness, after all? What do they allow in the school of poets, where there are so many lines to learn, such exacting rhymes and meters to emulate? What would have happened to her emerging wildness when she was contracted to be married and her career disrupted, without so much as a by your leave? Now, it's important to note she was leaving more than just a husband when she set out alone on that damp dawn. She was leaving her profession and abandoning those who would await her stories at the festival fires. She was leaving her sacred storyteller's place by the royal hearth. She wasn't just disappointing a spouse. She was disappointing a king and a kingdom. And yet, Cludhmor walked faster. There was an unseen force that pulled her westward toward the infinite ocean she'd only seen a handful of times in her nearly 3 decades in this world. As she strode on, she could feel the softness of the grasses and the sharpness of the stones through her leather slippers in a way that made her come more fully alive. She felt the rose gold of dawn like a balm on her skin, and she heard the birds chattering, and she understood their language in a new way. Walking day and night until she lost track of how long she'd been gone and how many suns had set upon her hunger, she could finally smell and taste the sea. And the morning was opening bright and blue over the deepest gray greens of the ocean. Here, her soul unspooled, and she realized how cruel a cage had been cast by her tutors, the druids, her father, her husband, and even that sacred legion of words. She let the bonds of their rules and laws and the whole weight of civilization fall away. It was carried by the Atlantic winds, and she began to feel unburdened. Perhaps, she thought, this is what it feels like to be free. She was weary, but her Taurus, her journey, was nearly done. She did not know what life awaited her on the strand, but she knew that once she crossed the dunes and found herself where the sand was touched by the waves, she would be home. Only when she crested the final dune did she realize what had been calling her. It was not simply the natural music of the sea, all rhythm and no melody. No, it was an actual song that came from a great sleeping monster just beyond the tide. Now, Cludhmor had never seen a beast like this, but it did not move as she approached. She remembered her own tales of the women and the heroes who lived in the western islands beyond the horizon. She was finally seeing the Leviathan she had described in her story of the great voyagers. This whale had lain there a long time, and its bones were picked clean, except for the sinews strung between the great animal's ribs. The wind picked up from the water, and the song began. This is what had called her across the dunes and perhaps across the entire county and country and more. This song was the wildness she had yearned for, the wordless truth she knew to be hers in her own heart's core, but had never claimed as her own until that moment by the shore. When she realized she had not slept. In all the days and nights she'd been wandering, she had never laid down her head. And when she thought back to those nights beside Macwell, when she'd been forced to listen to the cacophony of his oblivious breath, she realized she could not recall the last time she had surrendered herself to the wilds of dream. Cludhmor lay herself down, and she slept. She slept like a child before her head had been filled with generation upon generation of bardic tales. She slept like a wild thing who was not held by the container of schools and the endless swirl of student life. She slept like a maiden who had not been sold off to suit her father's ambitions. She slept like a creature held by the embrace of the earth, finally safe in the sheltering song of this peaceful giant of the sea. Cludhmor slept. She slept like a woman who was finally blissfully alone. She did not realize she had been followed. For all the days and nights she had wandered, drawn ever onward by this invisible pull, by the rewilding urge inside of her, there was another who was pulled by a force that was just as strong. Macwell had pursued her. He was not driven by malice, by jealousy, by rage of betrayal. He was driven by love. From the first moment he had clapped eyes on Cludhmor, he had been besotted. Though not a man of particular intellect, he was no fool. It's just that he was struck dumb in the presence of his brilliant betrothed. He could barely string one sentence along to the next when he sat beside her at the banquet table. There was enough for him to gaze on her hair as dark as the raven wing, her cheek as white as snow, her lips as crimson as drops of lifeblood. His wife had thought him an Egypt at first. Then she thought him a jailer, just another man who would bid her behave to fit his plan. She scowled at his gentle way with the cows, the way his hands were so sure as he refashioned a new bridle for her horse, and the way he spoke so kindly to all, from the dairymaids to the children to the elders who sat in their doorways deaf and blind to the world. You see, Cludhmor was a brilliant woman, but she'd never been allowed the tenderness that was part of Macwell's very nature. It was there in her stories. In the tears of the young widow, the kindness of the mother sending her son to battle, in the passion between lovers who've been kept apart by a taciturn chieftain. But kindness hadn't had a place in her own story. Her mother had no voice by her father's hearth. Cludhmor had seen her brothers beaten for showing mercy. She herself had been heard to say that she believed that womanish ways were a weakness in men, and perhaps in women too. Certainly her father would scoff if he realized that she'd been married to such a weakling as the kindly Macwell. But that father of hers was too busy counting the size of his new herds to spare a thought for his brilliant daughter or her marriage. And though she hated herself for allying herself with her father's narrow, wicked views, she was shaped by them so perfectly, she could not imagine a world in which she remade herself. She had poems to recite, crowds to please. She had a husband who had to be endured. Well, all of this was true, until the day she stood up and left it all behind. Cana was unchangeable, and the world was unchanged until the song inside of her. The song passed down by generations of poets who had an entire country's history and culture in their compositions, dissolved into one woman's internal scream. She suddenly knew she could endure the weight of those expectations no more. She could no longer stay vigilant and asleep at the same time. She could not stand to be an exile from her own dreams in this narrow, wicked world of prescribed songs and predetermined roles in the same old places. If she had not been so wrapped up in the stories of the ancients and the expectations of the crowd, she might have realized that Macwell was never a stupid man. She might have spied the spark that lit the eyes that danced above his silent lips. She might have known he was a keen observer and a witness to her pain, as well as a man who saw her strength and her smarts. Macwell realized that his wife was exhausted in ways that she could not see, despite all of her cleverness and her ability to play the poet's game. He realized that she needed sleep like a lamb needs its mother. He watched her lie down to rest, and his heart burst open. Silently, he wept as he watched her sleep. He, too, was entranced by the sound, the song of the wind in the whalebones. Clever in his own way, he could see the way the air strummed the sinews. He gently knocked on the great bones and realized they sounded hollow. Unlike his wife, he was not moved to sleep. He was moved to innovation. He stroked his wife's brow, his heart opening and breaking all at once to realize this is the only time he touched her and she had not cringed. Then he let his fingers play on those dry bits of whalebone, those dry bits of whale gut, nature's strings, before leaving the woman and the divine instrument to their lullabies. Made his way over the dunes and deep inland. He walked so far, he knew he was only dreaming that song of the sea. He walked until he reached an ancient wood. There he found a fallen willow tree and pulled the hatchet from his belt. It's impossible to know how much time passed as he hollowed out the trunk to create the sound box, fashioned a sturdy pillar to support it, and found a gently curving limb to top his new creation. Lovingly, he sanded the wood and joined the invisible seams. He carved knots of his own design into the curved top and the long angles of the sides. He pulled rough cloths and fine cloths from his satchel and worked that wood until it shone with the life of its original living magic. Pleased with his work, he slung his creation over his arm and stravagued back to where his wife lay. Though he had worked the entire day through and the sun was near its setting, she still lay there sleeping. The song played on, the melody filling the air as the shadows of the ever-sleeping whale stretched long upon the sand. He sang to himself as he worked. He sang to himself as he pulled out his clever knife and cut those sinews from the whalebone. He sang to himself as he cut each string, and soon it was less the ethereal music of the other world, and instead was the hum of a lover. Now, this was a foreign sound to Cludhmor. She'd never heard it. She'd never let herself hear it. Her husband's song pulled her from her well-deserved dreams, and she sat up with a start, her harsh words ready. The Fila aren't just able to inspire with their verses. They could also craft what was called a satire, a vivid curse that could raise boils on the skin. She could have taken down this criminal with the satire that would make him pay for killing what she now loved best, the song that finally gave voice to her wildness and offered her true peace. Mackwell was loosening the final string from the whale when he heard his wife's hissed curses. He would gladly take the wound, for he was not a vain man, but he realized her words were pointing not at his fair cheeks, but at his strong and capable hands. "No," he screeched like a child afraid of his father's fist. "I've come to you with a gift, Mokri." The blisters began to appear upon his fine, strong fingers, even though those hands were well calloused with honest work and inspired craft. On and on spun her harsh words, the angry words she had stored inside her too-tamed heart, ripped out with the wildness of her need. Mackwell's blood began to drip upon the wood, even as he frantically strung each whale gut strand to the new frame he'd made. Muscle exposed, he could hear the tapping of his own finger bones against the wood as he tied the final sinew to the instrument he'd made. He did not have the words to stop her, but with his last strength, he ran his fingers along the strings. The song of the sea, the whale's great gift, wafted from the new object fashioned by Mackwell's clever, loving hands. It was even sweeter than the song played by the wind. Cludhmor was finally silent. She stared at her husband, at his bloodied hands, at the thing of beauty that he clutched to him, at the tears that washed the blood from the strings. For the first time in memory, she was weeping. She felt that wildness that had come over her crest like a wave. This time, it did not wash away, and it did not wash her away. Instead, it swept her up, and she felt a rush like never before. She was carried to Macwell, the man she had dismissed and despised. She was carried through the wilderness and back again to a place, a new place, inside of herself. Now there's much talk of how a poet could wound with their words, and less talk of whether they could use their wounds to heal. I like to think that she could. That Cludhmor could wrap syllables and phrases around her husband's wounded hands and make Macwell's fingers whole again. I like to think that she was made whole again in the process. I like to imagine them walking back from the strand, the harp slung over his shoulder, the song of the sea, and KnotWork in her heart. I like to imagine they had the great whale's blessing. I like to think this is a worthy beginning of the Cludhmor, the harp, which would become something truly magical and mythical in the hands of both gods and harpers for millennia. The presence of the harp would deepen and transform the art of the poets, the Fila, and the storytellers, the Shanachie. It would birth the bards. This harp would become the symbol of Ireland's identity across the centuries, as the country stood and fell, and stood and fell, and finally stood again, against the invaders who insult this land for her wildness, even as they lusted after her wild spirit. But those invasions were a long time off. On this day that the harp was born, let's imagine simply that Cludhmor and Macwell lived happily, and most importantly, wildly ever after. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing in the story and in the songs. Thank you.
Thank you. That's lovely.
So, as is my way, when I'm not writing stories, I'm holding space for storytellers. That's the day job, one of the many day jobs. And what I ask folks after we've written, after we've been with stories, let's say, is simply that question of what came through for you. Because I think that so often is the biggest way through. And I'm just curious if anybody wants to share what came through for them in the hearing of this story. Whether it's a word or a phrase or an idea that's just coming to light. And as we think about that, I have one other question for you. My story needs a name. I can write names I can title things for other people. I can do all the time. I'm very clever in many things. Names, terrifying. So, if anyone has one, I'm accepting suggestions. Whether it comes through right now or any time, it's going to be maybe a month or two before we put this one on the podcast. So we have a little time, but I could use your help.
Beach babies. Well, a pun is coming through.
Say that again, Liz?
A wordplay is coming through.
Yeah.
Wailing and wailing.
Oh,
That
yes.
she had to find her real voice, her wail. She had a wail.
Yeah.
And the whale helped her wail.
Yes. Yes. Would you play us another song?
Oh, sure.
And then I think we might close out and have a little wine and just relax. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. It's my first time out in quite some time. I think the last time I was here to hear one of Maura's songs. I also want to say I'm very blessed to have a KnotWork storytelling podcast guest and storyteller here with us tonight. Maura's song of The Most Ferocious Lady at the Castle is episode 3, if I do believe, and found wherever you listen to podcasts and at knotworkstorytelling.com. And it's a fabulous story that I would love for you to check out and listen to. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Did anybody have any questions about the harp at all, or?
Know where to find us.
Yeah.
We're not going anywhere. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you. That last song brought me to tears.
It's actually called the glass of beer, so. Say, what is it called? The glass of beer.
It is called the glass of beer. We have wine. I considered Guinness, but it seemed like overkill. Hey, Katie Glazer.